By inviting me to speak today, you're automatically inviting me to speak again next year. Let me explain why. Global macroeconomists like myself, they do two things. First, they come up with forecasts and scenarios and predictions, and then they have to show up later on to explain why those predictions went wrong. So that's a first disclaimer here. You have to invite me again next year. But joking aside, let me take a step back, look at the bigger picture in terms of the broader macroeconomic landscape, and let me make 3 points. I like number 3 because it's easier to remember. So point number 1, interest rates are higher for longer. Global interest rates are higher for longer. So let me give you very briefly a historical perspective here. In the 70s in the United States, inflation was very high. Paul Volcker came to the Fed, hike interest rates very high. Since then, inflation has been under control. Interest rates have been coming down over the last several decades. I mean, ups and downs, monetary policy cycles, but on average, rates have been coming down. Not just the policy interest rates, which is for the short term, but also if you look at the long end of the yield curve, I mean, yields for 10-year treasury bills, they have been coming down as well steadily for several reasons. That has changed. It changed around COVID a few years ago. Now, interest rates for the long end of the curve are increasing. And my point is that they are structurally going to be higher for many years to come, which changes the landscape for capital flows to emerging markets and financing for development. What's going on, I think, here is the following. Let me tell you a story. I worked for the IMF for a few years. You know what IMF stands for? It's not International Monetary Fund. IMF means it's mostly fiscal. I say that because when I was at the fund, you go to a country, you're a part of a mission. By the way, it feels very religious, right? It's a mission. Supposedly, IMF people defend the missionary position, I don't know. But anyway, my point is that you go to a mission to a country, and then you basically argue the problem here is fiscal. Put your fiscal house in order, right? You go to a country in Africa, let's say, you'll say, well, we'll hike interest, hike taxes, cut spending, and things will be better. So I say this because during the pandemic, even the IMF was saying, you know what? These are unprecedented times. Go ahead and spend like crazy. And countries did. Everyone did it. The problem is that defensible as fiscal expansion was back at the time, it outlived its usefulness. I mean, it's very easy to increase spending. It's very hard to bring it down. Few things are as permanent as a temporary increase in fiscal spending. So as a result, fiscal deficits are much larger now than before, and the public sector debt has jumped very high and is expected to continue to increase for many years to come. So this puts pressure, this crowds out potential flows to private sector, to emerging markets in particular. And this picture, I think, is aggravated by what's happened in terms of geopolitics. Let me explain. In the US in particular now, of course, there's less support to NATO. And that means that countries in Europe, in particular, have to spend more on defense. They, for many, many years, under the umbrella of security provisions by NATO under the US leadership, Europe could afford to invest in other things, didn't have to invest as much in the military and defense. Those days are over. So it's a traditional trade-off between guns and butter. You know, if you read the textbook economics, you see this analogy, right? In an economy, if you produce only two things, guns or butter, it's a trade-off. You produce one or the other. Well, Europe was able to produce lots of butter, meaning social safety scheme, because it didn't have to spend on defense. Those days are over. This means additional pressure on fiscal accounts in Europe, on top of other pressures that are going to be there anyway, namely aging and climate change. Both will require increase in spending for many years to come. So I tell you this story, Victor, to come to the conclusion that there will be pressures, fiscal pressures on the debt dynamics, and that will be putting pressure on the long end of the yield curve. There is a debt premium that is there, and it's here to stay. Along with that, I think there is also an inflation premium because inflation is proving, particularly in the United States, to be a bit stickier than people thought. Inflation, the pandemic went high to 8%. It's easier to bring inflation down from 8 to 4% than to cut it by half again from 4 to 2. I mean, it's like toothpaste. It's easy at the beginning, but gets progressively harder towards the end, right? That's a picture of inflation. So there is an inflation premium. Inflation in the US in particular is clearly above the 2% target. The Fed is cutting rates in any way. There's a lot of pressure from the White House on the Fed, so this could erode the credentials of the Fed. This means an inflation premium for the yield curve as well. So to make a long story short, I think my point that rates are going to be higher for longer, point number one. If you allow me quickly to go point number two and point number three, point number two is that the geopolitical fragmentation is here to stay. This is more than just Trump. I think Trump is a consequence, is a reflection of much deeper, wider trends. And I think that has to do with the backlash against globalization, because for many years, globalization produced incredibly positive results for the global economy as a whole. Lower inflation, faster growth, free trade liberalization, and so on. However, the gains from globalization were not equally distributed. I mean, within each economy, each country, there are winners and losers. The economy as a whole gains, but within the economy, there are winners and losers. And we as a society, I don't think we're able to properly redistribute the gains from winners to losers. That's why you have this backlash against globalization. And it's not just in the US, it's not just Trump. I can see parallels in Europe as well, mega movements. Let's say, if you look at UK, you have Reform UK. If you look at France, you have the National Rally. If you look at Germany, you have the AfD parties, all tending towards, I mean, right-wing populism that puts pressures on fiscal accounts as well, leads to more fragmentation, and I think this is here to stay. Since the post-Second World War, you had this US-led, rules-based global environment. These days are over. The US is clearly taking a step back from its leadership role across a range of multilateral institutions. I mean, think about the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, think about the United Nations more broadly, think about NATO. Even in regional terms, the so-called NAFTA agreement, the trade agreement between US, Mexico, and Canada, has been rewritten unilaterally by the United States. I mean, they call it now USMCA. Whenever I say that, it feels like I'm saying YMCA. So, but that's a different thing. Anyway, the US is unilaterally stepping back, and this is here to stay. And one clear example of that is tariffs. So tariffs in the United States is something that Trump sees as a policy hammer, so to speak. And look, if the only instrument you have in your hand is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's what's happening, right? They use tariffs for everything. If you have an issue with illegal drugs coming to the United States, you impose tariffs on Canada. If you have a problem with immigration, impose tariffs on Mexico. If you have a problem with India importing oil from Russia, tariffs on India. If you have a problem with politics, if you have a problem with the friend of Trump in Brazil, former President Bolsonaro, going to jail for wrongdoing, well, impose tariffs on Brazil. So you use tariffs for everything. And the problem is also that tariffs are bad for growth, tariffs are bad for inflation, but they are being used to try to achieve completely different goals. It's actually not clear what Trump wants with those tariffs. In my mind, actually, he wants so many different things at the same time that in my mind, it feels like that song by the Spice Girls. Tell me what you want, what you really, really want, because it's not clear. He wants to address the trade deficit. He wants to have more tax revenues. He wants to have more jobs. And those are conflicting goals. I mean, quick example here. If you are really successful in bringing firms to produce in the United States, so you promote jobs, by definition, are not important anymore. You don't have tax revenues. So they're conflicting goals. My point, therefore, I think this is a structural shift in the global geopolitical landscape. It goes well beyond Trump. It's really global. It's here to stay. And In that environment, you see Europe in a very tricky scenario position, because you have now, rather than a globalized environment, you have fragmented environment with spheres of influence. I mean, in the Americas, of course, US still plays an important role. China in Asia is key, and Europe is trying to find its way. I mean, there's talk about strategic autonomy. I'm not sure how successful it is unless we have deeper integration in Europe. So this could be a silver lining for Europe if the crisis leads to more Europe. You have further integration, because Europe is an incomplete integration program, right? You had monetary integration with the euro, but on the fiscal front, on the labor front, on the rules, you still are far beyond what's really necessary for Europe to be able to stand up as a major power in global landscape. So that's my point number two. I'm taking longer than I should, but my point number two is global fragmentation is here to stay. Third point, more quickly, to end on a more positive note, I think there are challenges and opportunities as well, especially if I think about the outlook for climate change. So climate change, thinking about Africa especially, right, bringing it closer to the seminar here, it's interesting because, I mean, Africa is the region that least contributes to global emissions, right? Big producers of the polluters are the US and China, but it offers actually tremendous opportunities in terms of green energy. So that's one area in particular where I see challenges, of course, which are obvious. You can deny climate change, but it doesn't stop it from happening. But I see major opportunities in renewables, in Europe in general, but in Africa as well, especially. So to make a long story short, my three key messages are: first, interest rates are higher for longer. Second, global fragmentation is here to stay. Third, climate change brings challenges, but also opportunities, including for Africa. Thank you.